So far, in most of the course, we have focused on efficiency. So the goal of public policy should be to have outcomes that are as efficient as possible, as in that maximize a welfare measure, in most cases a utilitarian welfare measure. So in simpler terms, what we so far had as the main goal of government intervention, of public policy, was to increase the size of the pie. And we've learned through the first welfare theorem that if we have free markets, that can actually lead to can actually maximize the pie. It leads to an efficient outcome. There are obviously obstacles to that, and we learned two of them, namely public goods and externalities, that often bring us into this position where we are, where markets do not deliver an efficient outcome, and we are in this world where government interventions actually can improve efficiency. There are also situations where free markets don't lead to an efficient outcome simply because of asymmetric information, because of things like monopolies or oligopolies, and all sorts of things that characterize our markets in the real world, that bring us from what is called a first best scenario to a second best. So the first best scenario was one where we can actually redistribute through a lump sum transfer without any welfare loss. In a second best world, and this is probably as good as it gets for most policy, it's actually different. It's actually even harder, because there is a trade-off. There's a trade-off to be made between equity and efficiency. So if we want to have an outcome that is more equitable, because this is what as a society we will prefer, that actually would mean that we are no longer having the maximum amount of efficiency. So in a nutshell, what I'm talking about here, or what you can illustrate as well, is through those two pie charts here. The one on the very left is one where you have a fairly equal distribution between orange and blue, whereas in the one on the right, you actually have a fairly unequal distribution, but a bigger pie. And there seems to be this trade-off between having a big pie, but that is very unequally distributed, or a smaller pie that is equal. And so in this lecture number 5, we will talk a lot about equity versus efficiency, but we will focus a lot more on the equity aspect. So when you focus, or when you follow the public debate, when you read the newspaper, watch TV, YouTube, whatever you do, you come across discussions about inequality of income, inequality of wealth, or inequality of opportunity. So simply the equality or inequality of access to things like education, healthcare, and so on. So inequality comes in many shapes and forms. So what I want to do at the start of this lecture is I just want to take a step back and take the big picture of the data, to show you some global trends in inequality, and also give you an idea of some of the interesting questions that economists these days are working on. Now, if you want to have an introduction to the topic of inequality that's very accessible, I can highly recommend to you the video that I've linked up here. Also, what I will show you is I will show you a lot of graphs from a phenomenal website that's called Our World in Data, that is run by a team at Oxford University. And this team have put together an incredible database and a visualization tool where on their website you can look at whatever topic you want, and you find long time series. So for example, here you see poverty rates from the mid 1800s to the early 2000s. And so they compiled all sorts of data on economic development. They also, during the COVID pandemic, have put together basically real-time trackers of infection rates. They have historical data, they have newer data. So if you look for any data for writing a thesis or a term paper, this is definitely a place to look at. And it's generally, if you want to have an informed debate, we need good data. And this website creates a, wait for it, very important public good. Yeah. Now, the first graph I want to show you is the following. It shows the level of extreme poverty in different countries over time, or in different regions. And so extreme poverty is measured in is basically a person is considered poor if they have less than 1.25 US dollars in 2000. And then obviously $1.25 in 2000 buys you a lot less than it would have bought you in 1850. And so what has been done here is that they've used the deflator. So they deflated everything to $2,000 to make incomes across those years actually comparable. And so on the vertical axis, you have then the share of people in each of those countries that live in what is considered extreme poverty. Now, whenever someone says poverty, you have to always ask back almost, like, what do you mean by poverty? There is no one single definition of poverty. Poverty measures, we will see this in this lecture, they always involve drawing a line that can be very arbitrary and say everyone whose income or wealth is below that line is considered poor. There is no perfect measure. There are measures that may be more appropriate in some contexts than in others, but there is no perfect measure of poverty. So just be aware of that. I'm not sure if this is the best measure that we can come up with, but on that website they use it for probably good reason. And so what it shows some very important trends that should actually make us quite optimistic. Typically when you hear people talking about development, they say, oh, the world is becoming worse, and it's a lot worse now than it was in the 1950s. And despite all this economic growth, there's a lot of countries that are getting poorer, the poorest are getting poorer, and so on. When you look at websites like Our World in Data that give you the actual data, you will see immediately that those statements are not, in most cases, not true. Yes, there are people who got poorer over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, but these are typically groups within countries. But when you look at averages of countries, there is hardly any country that got poorer over time. And so here we are looking at poverty rates within countries. And you can very clearly see here that the US in the early 19th century already had much lower poverty rates than some other countries, notably other former British colonies or Japan, which nowadays is obviously one of the richest countries in the world and which has pretty much eradicated this type of extreme poverty altogether. But you can also see that in all those countries, you have a strong decline in extreme poverty. And so even in Ireland these days, where we have lots of discussion for good reason about homelessness, the share of people who live in extreme poverty by any reasonable poverty measure is actually very, very low. And what can also be seen here is that the decline in poverty happened in former British colonies here a lot earlier than it happened, for example, in Italy or in Japan. And if you go on that website, you can also plot this for different countries. So this is just the ones I've chosen here to have a certain range of countries. And they also do the same thing for the world. Okay, so this is then the fraction of the world population that was living in extreme poverty. And it is quite astonishing to think that in 1850, with everything we know, about 80% of the global population were living in what we would, today's living standards, consider as extreme poverty. And that has gone down dramatically, but obviously is still quite high. Now we're now maybe at 25% or so, but that's still extremely high. So there's obviously quite some progress to be made. Now, will we talk in this course about how to reduce extreme poverty in developing countries? No, that would merit an entire course, development economics, which we are currently offering at the undergrad and master's level. But I just wanted to mention that inequality and poverty is obviously a global phenomenon, but we can also see trends that should make us quite optimistic. Also, one of the myths that you oftentimes hear is the world is becoming more unequal. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. And while the rich are getting richer, the poor getting poorer may be true in some places, globally, this is actually not necessarily the case. In fact, the world over the last 20-25 years has become a more equal place, believe it or not. So what we see here is the distribution of annual incomes, and it's standardized to 2005 US dollars. And they basically just, it's the distribution of the entire world population. And then you can see through those different colors what part of the world is responsible for these, for this distribution. And you can see that in 1988, so that's not so long ago. I was already alive at the time. Most of our students most likely not. But it's not so long ago. Your parents, if you ask them, they will certainly remember that time. You can see that large parts of the world population were living below this poverty line of $1.25 a day. And even if you make it a bit higher, let's say that would give you an annual income of $465. If you put it to $2,000 in 2005's purchasing power parities, it would still, this is probably 2/3 of the world population. There would just be a small elite in places such as China and India that would live above that line. Then obviously in other parts of the world, you have other types of, for example, Latin America and the Caribbean. You see that there are actually, the span, they span quite a wide range of income. Okay? Interestingly, also, sub-Saharan Africa at the time, it was growing a lot in population in the last 30 odd years, but obviously it's very small in population compared to China and India and then other Asian countries. So if these countries make a leap forward in terms of income, that actually leads to a more equal distribution of incomes in the world, global population. And that's what we can see here. So that time series in that page only goes to 2011. It would actually be interesting to update that. But you can see here that especially China and to some extent also India moved a lot to the right. and that we still see in sub-Saharan Africa, we can still see that there is actually, that this is at sub-Saharan Africa still has a lot of people below this poverty line, but of course also has some people who earn a lot, just not very many. Okay, but these big shifts in the global income distribution are the result of strong economic growth in China and India that meant a huge improvement in living conditions for many people in those countries. The world, through whatever forces caused this, globalization, catch-up growth, technological change, and so on, the world is actually becoming a more equal place, believe it or not. But, so what's all this discussion about inequality about then? Should we all not be then extremely happy? The world is becoming a better place, poverty goes down, it's becoming more equal, so what's the problem? But obviously inequality is a very multidimensional problem, so there are many aspects to it that one can look at, and some that we may actually not be very happy with. And if I can give you recommendations of, if you're looking for very good popular science books to read, but ones that are at a very high level on that topic, I highly recommend the work of Branko Milanovic, who is one of the leading thinkers when it comes to inequality. Now, he has become famous, he's been famous before coming up with this graph, but this graph even made him more famous. And that graph, for obvious reasons, is called the elephant curve. Now that's a very powerful graph because it shows that the growth in the world, in world income, over this 20-year period from the late 1980s to the beginning of the financial crisis of 2008, was very uneven. Very uneven. So we see here that, let's look first at the tail of the elephant. We can see here that for the very poorest people, so let's actually start here. What is on the horizontal axis? That's probably the most. So on the horizontal axis, you get the percentile of a person in the global income distribution in 1988. So what we see here, so these are the 5% poorest people in 1988, and these are the 5% richest people in it. And what we want to know then is, for each percentile here, we want to know to what extent has their income grown, the income of that group, over those 20 years. And so for that group here, let's say at the median, at the 50th percentile, incomes have grown by about 70%. So overall, you can say, the world incomes have grown on average by about 50% over a 20-year period. And now let's look at how this growth was distributed across people, basically. And let's look at different groups in the income distribution of 1980. And so here you can see those who were the poorest in 1988, their incomes in real terms, so deflating incomes to adjust for changes in prices, their incomes haven't grown at all, which is remarkable. Then when you look at, and why is that? Well, there are, these are mainly people in developing countries to whom the opportunities for income growth haven't arrived yet. Right? And so you can read a lot in the literature on development on so-called poverty traps or development traps. There are many reasons for that. For example, it's when the technological frontier to do well in life is very high, when you need to know a lot and be well educated, reaching that frontier until you reach the frontier, your income just cannot grow because you are not in any way productive that you can sell anything on global markets and so on. That can be a reason. There can be reasons such as corruption, wars, and so on. So there are many causes of that, but these tend to be developing countries or groups within developing countries who are just locked out of growth due to poverty. Then what you can see here is for anyone who was between the 10th percentile and the 70th percentile, really, in 2000 and in 1988, they had a massive growth in those 20 years. So their incomes in real terms grew by about 60 to 70%. So these are lots of countries and lots of regions of the world, but it's mainly the emerging economies. So China, parts of India, then parts of Southeast Asia, the likes of Thailand, Vietnam, and parts of South America, especially Brazil, also Russia. So there are many countries in which large amounts of people have seen a huge income growth. And why? Well, because these countries have been growing a lot due to technological change, due to foreign direct investment, due to openness to trade, and you can basically say globalization and technological progress, and also political stability and societal progress in general were drivers of, right? So China opened itself up to world markets, and also allowed a more free market economy in certain places, and that unleashed huge growth potential. But the interesting bit comes now at the top, so where we have the trunk of. And here we have something very interesting, and here is the reason why so many people in what used to be called the Western Hemisphere, so North America and Europe, are so concerned with inequality, because these are the societies that in North America and in Europe are the societies that have been here in 1988. And now here you see what happened to the incomes of the people who were the middle class in 1988. Not much. So their incomes in real terms haven't grown almost at all over time. There are some exceptions, and Ireland is one because of the Celtic Tiger. But everyone else, their incomes haven't grown overly much. In some percentiles, it was even negative to grow. Whereas then you have what Milanovic calls the global elite, which are on the one hand, very rich people in places in pretty much all countries in the world. Their incomes have grown a lot as well. So you have this top 1% or 0.1 or 0.001% that at the very top, whose incomes have grown to the same amount with the same amount as the incomes of people in developing countries. But so when you take all this together, what does this mean for especially countries that were already developed in 1988? Their inequality has grown a lot. Okay? And so, there is lots of research done these days about the contribution of this development, which is mainly driven by, again, globalization, technological change, automation, forces like that. There is now a lot of research going into trying to understand to what extent that development contributed to political changes, such as the rise of Donald Trump in the US, the Brexit referendum, the rise of populist parties in many countries. And so there seems to be obviously this seems to have something to do with this economic development, that there are a lot of people who haven't experienced any economic progress, whereas there's others that actually have experienced a lot of economic progress. And all that is very neatly summarized with the elephant curve. Okay? So talking of the top 1%, here is also an interesting development that we could see in the last over more than the last century, which is that if you look at English-speaking countries that all have obviously a culturally and also politically a connection to the United Kingdom, still have or had, and whose economic and political system are similar. You can see here the famous U curve in income concentration. So the income share of the top 1% of earners was very high before World War II. So here you can see in for example, in the UK, that's the yellow line here, it was, so the top 1% of all people in the UK in terms of income, the income share that they had was 20%. And they're not quite up there again, but they're pretty much up there. Whereas in the US, there was, as in many countries, this equalization period of incomes after World War II, where lots of people lost their wealth and their income and so on. And so, basically the cards have been somewhat reshuffled, but the top 1% pretty much bounced back in the US. And you can also see that to some extent in Ireland as well. Whereas in other countries, it follows more an L shape up until now. So countries that are notorious for their welfare states, such as France or Netherlands, Denmark, or also Japan, they had this big decline in income concentration after World War II when, as I said, the cards were somewhat reshuffled. Some people who were previously rich lost all their wealth and also lost all their potential to have a high income in the future, whereas in and other people who did not have much before the war could all of a sudden benefit afterward. So there was a greater income mobility after World War II, and it has not led to this rebound in income concentration that you can see in English countries. That's a question that lots of social scientists are currently working on. Why is this the case? So here, this is just to give you another example of the extent of income concentration. So this is the real wage growth in the US by income percentile. And that data set is compiled by Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, and Gabriel Zuckman, who are three French economists who are very, very influential in research on inequality and taxation. They also have a very nice website that I link in the video at some point, or in this lecture at some point, called the World Income Database, where they also compiled lots of data. You can download it, you can play around with it, you can visualize things very easily. And what they have shown here in the US, for example, is that the massive income growth, so we're talking here about annual growth, okay? So from year to year, how much did the income grow? Now, so for the average adult, it was per year about 1.3%. But when you see that the top 0.001%, so this is one person in, let me think, 100,000 or 10,000? Anyway, a small fraction. It's 1 in 100,000. So this is really the top. These are the Great Gatsby type people. Their incomes have grown annually in that period by 6%. Right? So there is a huge inequality in growth, which has to do with the rise of tech firms and people who own these tech firms all of a sudden making huge amounts of money, and then other people stocks in those. so on. So it seems to have to do a lot with changes in financial markets and the concentration of ownership and so on. But on the other hand, and this is also what you can see here, the pre-tax incomes have been stable and have not grown at all for a huge part of the population, or were even negative. And then only through redistribution, through taxes, have their post-tax incomes actually grown per year on average. But even then, at a very low rate. And so this is something that is obviously, you could say, oh yeah, it's the US, and it doesn't happen as strongly in Europe, but it had the same development or similar development you could see in Europe as well. And if you're interested in that, you can look at their database, the World Income Database, WID, that has a lot more data on that. So this was just to give you a flavor of some of the topics surrounding inequality that economists are currently working on. These are by no means the only ones. This was just to give you a little bit of a teaser for why this is a fascinating and at the same time very, very important topic to study.